Most people are familiar these days with the Book of Enoch, so for this video we will be talking about the other texts found with Enoch among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a series of Jewish writings dating as far back as the 3rd century before Christ. Enoch itself is dated to at least a few centuries after the writing of the Book of Genesis, but expands on some of the more vague ideas that Genesis brings up, particularly the story of the fallen angels, or as the text refers to them, the sons of God. These beings are mentioned in Genesis 6 at the beginning of the narrative of Noah's Ark. Here, it describes how these sons of God took daughters from the line of men as their wives, which led to the birth of beings known as Nephilim, who existed in that time but also afterwards. Now, the sons of God is a term used in other biblical texts, such as the Book of Job, to refer to a group of divine beings that have influence over the earth, but who come up to heaven to converse with God. This was a sharp difference from Genesis 6 before the Great Flood, where they are presented as very material beings who are able to impregnate human women. The thing about Genesis is that, like the larger Torah it is a part of, and the larger Old Testament that is a part of, and the larger Holy Bible that is a part of, Genesis itself is a compilation of smaller stories that weren't necessarily written with each other in mind. In mythology, history is recorded using grand metaphor because there wasn't enough resources to write down all of the hard details of events that were not known to be particularly important at their time. Without any written history, you only get the fragmented oral history, and to make the stories themselves make sense, metaphor fills in the gaps. This led to the large polytheistic pantheons where every nation and city and tribe had their patron deities whose stories represented the history of their people. Adam and Eve were not originally written with the idea that they would be the parents of Cain and Abel, and those two brothers were not necessarily written as ancestors of Noah and the people of his time. Instead, each of these stories were different metaphorical perspectives on the same key conflicts that were said to take place before the Great Flood. These would later be sewn together into the Book of Genesis, with certain changes made to have the stories flow into each other as one cohesive history. This was already a tradition in the greater mythological world, with certain works like the Greek Theogony giving elaborate origin stories connected through extensive genealogies, all representing different peoples known to the Greeks at the time. The sons of God as a mythological symbol would become more popular following the final compilation of the Book of Genesis, and with more of their own history being understood through the examination of Genesis, the people of Judea began to write the stories we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some stories, such as the Book of Enoch or the Book of Giants, would be sort of insertable to the greater Genesis narrative, with Enoch filling in more details about the time after Cain and Abel, but before the birth of Noah. This is something we only get in the Book of Genesis in the form of Cain and Seth's genealogies, which races through the generations between those two key narratives. Other texts found with Enoch from the Dead Sea Scrolls include the Book of Jubilees and the Genesis Apocryphon, which both appear to retell the stories of Genesis as a whole with more elaborations, instead of being little insertable stories. By writing these different stories, the people of the Second Temple period in Judea were not changing the canon they held for the Torah, but really they were retelling the same stories with mythological figures that had become easier to understand for the people. With that in mind, let's examine these 4 texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls as well as a few others from throughout history to give us a full view of the story of the fallen angels. I would say the most comprehensive text with a history of the sons of God is the Book of Jubilees. As discussed, this was a rewriting of the Book of Genesis and Exodus, with many details being abridged, but some new details also being added in. The first few chapters read very similar to the existing stories of Genesis, with the world being created in 6 days, Adam and Eve being tempted by the serpent, and Cain killing his brother Abel. It is here that we begin to see the dramatic shift from the original Genesis story, with the story of many of Cain's descendants being removed entirely. In Genesis 4, Cain is born as the first child of Adam and Eve, who kills his brother Abel when God favors Abel's sacrifices over Cain's. Following this, Cain is said to be made a wanderer on the earth, where he eventually has a son named Enoch, different from the Enoch of Seth's line, who the Book of Enoch is about. Cain goes on to build the first ever city and names it after his son, which Jubilees also confirms, before suddenly ending this genealogy. In the true Book of Genesis, the story goes on to describe Cain's descendants well past Enoch and down to the children of Lamech, who himself commits a murder just as Cain had. Lamech's own children, however, are given various honors, such as being the fathers of music and metalworking, with Cain's final descendant Nama being the only woman named in these genealogies. As said before, the Sons of God narrative was eventually understood to just be one mythological symbol that represented the same historical conflict found in the stories of Genesis. In Genesis 6, for instance, the Nephilim are said to be the mighty men of old, the men of renown, something that may describe the line of Cain with all of their accomplishments, but not the line of Seth. The sons of God are described in Enoch as giving humans forbidden knowledge, equating them with the serpent from the Garden of Eden as well. Among the knowledge taught by the angels is also metalworking, something described as being pioneered by Cain's descendant, himself named Tubal-Cain. Later Jewish tradition generally associates the line of Cain with the sons of God and Nephilim, whether it be with Cain being the father of the Nephilim or Nama being the first human daughter to be taken by the sons of God. The Book of Jubilees and the writings we are discussing today, however, chose to essentially replace much of Cain's history in favor of pointing instead to the sons of God and Nephilim themselves. With that in mind, the true beginning of the fallen angels narrative starts with a comparison between the genealogy of Seth from the proper Book of Genesis with that of the Book of Jubilees. After the killing of Abel, Adam and Eve come together again to create a new son named Seth, who 10 generations down will give way to Noah, the only man righteous enough to be saved from the flood. Now, in the true Genesis, the genealogy of Seth is different from the genealogy of Cain's. While Cain's line was more about the stories of its people and their accomplishments, Seth's line is more about the lengths of time each lived. There is evidence that initially there was a different version of Seth's genealogy that was written in the same style as Cain's, as after Cain's genealogy, a genealogy for Seth begins in the same style, with anecdotes about its patriarchs similar to those found in the line of Cain. However, this genealogy cuts off right after the birth of Seth's son Enos. It gives us the little anecdote that in the time of Enos, people began to call upon the name of the Lord, after which the genealogy starts over in a more organized format, focusing on the length of time between the births and deaths of these various patriarchs. The Book of Jubilees retains the lifetime of the patriarchs while changing the measurement system from years to jubilees, which is a measurement of 49 years. However, it also adds anecdotes that some believe may have been found in the original genealogy of Seth's alongside Cain, though that has yet to be proven. Like with the true Book of Genesis, the Book of Jubilees describes Seth's line as passing from Enos to Canaan to Mahalalel, and then to Yared, where we suddenly get this anecdote. The word Yared means to descend, and it explains in Jubilees that this is the time that the beings known as the Watchers were known to descend to the earth. This term Watchers is a sort of subterm used to describe the nature of these sons of God. As Watchers, their job was to watch over and instruct humans in order to guide them towards righteousness, though it also says that they will judge the people of the earth. From here, the Book of Jubilees describes Yared as taking a wife who gives birth to his son Enoch. Being the firstborn following the descent of the angels, he received the important information that they provided, including that of writing, the stars, and the history of the world up to that time. This is sort of an abridged version of the Book of Enoch itself within Jubilees, emphasizing how important the Book of Enoch was in the culture even before the Book of Jubilees was written. Here, Enoch is described as having visions of the future up to the great days of judgment, or what we refer to now as the end times. Tradition holds that Enoch was taken up to heaven by the angels above the Watchers, where he was able to receive divine knowledge while also testifying against the sin that the Watchers had committed. Here, they are described as taking those human wives, something they had to unite to do as a rebellious act against God. Despite the angels being sent to render judgment on the earth, Enoch is raised to the level of an angel in Jewish tradition, and here is described as becoming the judge of both man and the fallen angels. The Book of Enoch itself opens with Enoch being given these visions, and the Watchers having already taken their human wives. The angels as a whole are described as needing to give humans certain knowledge, but the sons of God just end up passing on forbidden knowledge to their wives and giant children that end up corrupting humanity. The giant children of the sons of God, also known as the Nephilim, which translates as fallen ones, are said to be so big that it causes their mothers great pains to birth them, and they end up devouring the humans around them when they run out of food. In chapter 10, the leader of the fallen angels, Azazel, is bound into a pit within the earth, with these Watchers having to see the destruction of their descendants. The Book of Jubilees mirrors this, describing the angels as a whole being put into the earth, and their giant descendants the Nephilim being forced to slay each other in battle before the Great Flood. Another text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Book of Giants, which tells the story of the giants more from their side. In fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Giants depicts a few giants living before the flood, having dreams of their eventual demise. For instance, one giant appears to dream of a tablet containing many names being washed in the water and coming out with only 3 names, seemingly representing the 3 sons of Noah who survived the flood. The giants decide to ask the wise Enoch for help interpreting the dreams and go on a great journey to reach him with their pleas. Enoch, however, delivers the news that the line of giants has caused the corruption of physical existence, and they are to be destroyed in the flood. This text is interesting not just for claiming to be a testament from the side of the giants that supports the flood narrative of the people of Israel, but because of how it continues to portray the idea of the mediator figure that Enoch was known to become when taken to heaven. The sons of God were the ones who were meant to cast judgment on earth initially, but when they fell to sin and begat the Nephilim, Enoch is given that role over them. In the Book of Enoch chapter 13, the Nephilim don't just ask for help interpreting their fate like in the Book of Giants, but even ask for Enoch to intercede on their behalf. Enoch is the intermediary who carries those prayers, but still he only brings back the answer of their inevitable destruction. The story of the fallen angels does not end here, however, and continues before the flood in the text of the Genesis Apocryphon. While the Genesis Apocryphon appears to be an entire retelling of Genesis similar to Jubilees, what we have of it is very fragmented, though the few parts we do have are very interesting. The Genesis Apocryphon would probably start with these 6 days of creation and then go into the Garden of Eden narrative, but the fragments we have only begin near the beginning of Noah's life. Here it picks up with his father, who is also named Lamech. In a bizarre twist, Lamech is said to be afraid that his son Noah is actually the child born from his wife sleeping with a Watcher or Nephilim. Despite her claims that she has been faithful to Lamech, he still asks his father Methuselah for help, and that he might ask his own father Enoch for the full truth. Enoch is able to deliver the divine statement that Noah is in fact the child of Lamech and not descended from any divine being or Nephilim. This story is given a smaller mention near the end of the Book of Enoch, with a more elaborate description of Noah looking like the Nephilim and that he had glowing skin and white hair. The Genesis Apocryphon, however, goes on to explain more of Noah's life leading up to the flood, and while in the ark, he is given a vision of the Nephilim and the blood that they poured upon the earth, symbolizing their violence. Noah, meanwhile, presents himself as the righteous man chosen to continue on after the flood by God himself. And thus, the flood marks the end of the old world where the Nephilim and the sons of God were the dominating force to a new era after the flood. Now, in the original book of Genesis, the Nephilim are not mentioned again by any known name, but Genesis 6 promises that the Nephilim existed not just in that time, but also afterwards, and thus they are encountered again in the Old Testament. Following the flood, the biblical canon has the cursing of Ham's son Canaan, the table of dispersed nations descended from Noah, the incident of the Tower of Babel that led God to divide these peoples up, the story of Abraham and his descendants leading to their enslavement in Egypt, and finally the escape from Egypt in the book of Exodus. From here, different books give similar accounts of the Israelites returning to the land of Canaan to find descendants of the Nephilim known as the Anakim there, such as in Numbers 13. The Anakim are given several names and associations from here, including groups like the Rephaim and Emim, and even names of specific great leaders and rulers. The Old Testament as a whole becomes about how these giants are among the most important enemies of the Israelites as they begin to take back their promised land, but their conflict is ultimately not resolved, with some of the giants always managing to remain living on. Now, in the Book of Jubilees, the Nephilim are all killed off before the flood, going to war with each other, and the flood seemingly wiping out what is left of them. But it describes their spirits being trapped on the earth because of this, causing chaos, and God attempts to bind them so that they won't interfere with his plans. The leader of these spirits, Mastema, asks permission from God to keep 1/10 of the spirits in order to test men by leading them astray. This is similar to the Book of Job, where Satan, one of the sons of God, is given permission to test humans by coming down to the earth and interfering with their lives. This reflects a tradition found elsewhere in the Bible where God is portrayed as leading Israel and other gods, or sons of God, leading the other nations. This is something expressed in Deuteronomy, where our current version of the Old Testament says that God divided the nations to the number of the sons of Israel. This doesn't make a lot of sense, as we know there are 12 tribes of Israel, but in the Table of Nations, the descendants of Noah, Shem, Japheth, and Ham are divided into 70 names or tribes. This number instead reflects the number found in the earliest copies of the Bible among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which state that the nations were divided based on the number of the sons of God. The idea of 70 sons of God, or B'nai Elohim as they are called in Hebrew, actually predates the Israelite people and stems from the Canaanite and Ugaritic tradition. In the Ugaritic Baal cycle from as far back as 1400 BC, the elder god is known as El, who is surrounded by other gods, or his Elim, from which we get the word Elohim in Hebrew. El and his wife Asherah are said to have 70 B'nai Elim, or sons of El, the same number as the Table of Nations. This is mirrored again in chapter 82 of the Book of Psalms, which opens with God being presented as among a mighty council where he judges other gods, or other Elohim. These Elohim are described as misleading their nations and peoples, angering the Old Testament God. The Book of Jubilees follows that more spiritual interpretation, having the sons of God being spirits that mislead the people of the world, with God providing special protection for Israel. It is thus through the nations such as the Egyptians that the Israelites continue to battle against the sons of God in this text. The sons of God are an interesting trend in mythology that predate the Israelite religion and really seem to predate the Canaanite tradition itself, the concept referring to the larger idea that people had begun to worship their local tribal deities over the parent god that was modeled after the idea of a true divine guiding figure. With the transition to monotheism, Judaism would reduce the gods of those other pantheons to simple sons of God that were leading the different nations astray, though all seemingly as part of God's plan to test humanity and eventually bring about the reunification of humans under his divine rule. There is so much more that could be said about the overall history and various layers to this mythological symbolism that could ever fit into a video as short as this one, but if you want more information in that realm, subscribe, leave some suggestions or questions in the comments down below, and I'll work on some videos that tackle the subject from another angle. Please check out my previous video on the evil god of the Gnostic tradition, or my genealogy of the world gods and how they all relate from one pantheon to the next. And as always, if you really want to support us, consider checking out our Patreon. See you guys soon.